The orange flames licked the night sky like demonic tongues, and Natalie Burton could only stand there in her nightdress, barefoot in the dirt, watching everything her father had built turn to ash and ember. The barn that had housed 12 horses, stored feed for the winter, and held every tool needed to run the ranch was collapsing in on itself with thunderous crashes that echoed across the desert valley. She knew who had done this. Frank Garrison's men had been making threats for 3 months now, ever since her father died and left her the land they wanted for the railroad expansion. The year was 1884, and Agua Caliente, Arizona, was caught between the old ways and the new progress that came with steel rails and Eastern money. Natalie's 160 acres sat right in the path of the proposed route, and Garrison had made it clear that a 24-year-old woman had no business trying to run a ranch alone. She had refused his every offer, each one lower than the last, each one delivered with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. Now she watched her livelihood burn, acrid smoke filling her lungs as she coughed, and tears streamed down her soot-stained face. The horses had been in the pasture, thank God, but everything else was gone. The flames reflected in her blue eyes as she stood there, her long brown hair tangled around her shoulders, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She would not let them win. She would not abandon this land that her father had died protecting. She did not hear the rider approach until he was dismounting beside her, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. She turned, ready to fight if this was one of Garrison's men come to gloat, but the face she saw in the firelight was unfamiliar. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell to his collar and eyes that assessed the burning building with the practiced gaze of someone who understood what this loss meant. "You hurt." His voice was deep, rough as gravel, but there was genuine concern in it. "No," Natalie managed, her voice hoarse from smoke. "Who are you?" "Russell Fenton. I have the spread about 5 miles east near the foothills." He turned to look at her directly, and she saw anger in his expression. "I saw the glow from my porch. This was not an accident. It was not a question." Natalie shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as the night air raised goosebumps on her skin through the thin cotton nightdress. "Frank Garrison wants my land. He has been making offers. Tonight I found a note nailed to my door saying this was my last warning." Russell's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Garrison should have known. That snake has been squeezing out small ranchers all along the proposed rail line. He shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders without asking, the leather still warm from his body. "You have somewhere to go tonight. The house is fine. They only burned the barn." She pulled his coat tighter, grateful for the warmth and the kindness of this stranger. "I will rebuild. I will not let them drive me off." Something flickered in his dark eyes, something like respect mixed with concern. Rebuilding takes time and money and labor. Garrison will not stop with one fire. "Then I will rebuild twice if I have to." Her voice came out stronger than she felt, fierce with determination even as exhaustion and shock threatened to pull her down. Russell studied her for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his weathered face. He looked to be perhaps 27 or 28, old enough to have seen hard times and survived them. There were scars on his hands, the kind that came from working with rope and horses and the unforgiving land. "I will help you," he said finally. Natalie blinked. "What?" "I said I will help you rebuild. Bigger than before, strong enough that burning it down again would take more effort than Garrison wants to spend." He gestured toward the collapsing structure. "But you need to understand something. If I do this, I am making myself a target too. Garrison will know someone is backing you and he will not like it." "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Suspicion crept into her voice despite herself. In her experience, men did not offer help without expecting something in return. Russell's expression softened slightly. My father lost his ranch to men like Garrison back in Texas. Pushed off land he had worked for 20 years because he would not sell and would not fight dirty the way they did. He died broken, and I was too young and too stupid to help him the way he needed. I swore I would never let that happen again if I could stop it. He paused, then added, I am not asking for anything except maybe some of your coffee while we work, if you can spare it. Something in his words, in the honest pain behind them, made Natalie believe him. She extended her hand, formal despite the circumstances. Natalie Burton, and yes, I can spare the coffee. His hand engulfed hers, calloused and strong, and when their eyes met over the handshake, she felt something shift in her chest, some recognition she could not name. Then he released her hand and turned back to watch the fire, ensuring it did not spread to the dry brush beyond the barnyard. They stood together in silence until the flames died down to glowing embers, and the first gray light of dawn began to wash out the stars. Natalie's eyes burned with fatigue and smoke, but she could not bring herself to go inside, to turn her back on the destruction. Russell seemed to understand, remaining beside her like a silent sentinel until the sun finally crested the eastern hills and revealed the full extent of the damage. The barn was gone, reduced to a skeleton of blackened beams and piles of ash. The water trough nearby had cracked from the heat. Tools that had been hanging on the exterior wall were twisted lumps of metal. Natalie felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a physical thing, but she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She would not break. She could not afford to. I need to check on the horses, she said, her voice rough. And then I need to figure out where to start. Start with getting some rest, Russell said. You have been up all night. I will watch the place, make sure no one comes back to cause more trouble. When you wake up, we will make a plan. Natalie wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could handle this alone, but exhaustion was making her hands shake and her thoughts fuzzy. You need rest too. I am used to going without sleep. Comes with the territory when you run cattle. He gave her a slight smile, the first she had seen from him. Go on. I promise your land will still be here when you wake up. She hesitated, then nodded and turned toward the small adobe house that sat 50 yards from the destroyed barn. Inside, she finally let herself collapse onto her bed, still wearing Russell's coat, and fell into a dreamless sleep so deep she might have been unconscious. When she woke, the sun was high overhead and she could hear the sound of hammering. Natalie scrambled up, disoriented, and rushed to the window. In the barnyard, Russell had already cleared away some of the debris and was constructing what looked like a temporary shelter for tools and tack. His horse, a big roan gelding, was tied in the shade near her well, and he had stripped down to his shirt despite the October heat, his hat pushed back on his head. She dressed quickly in her work clothes, simple trousers and a man's shirt that had belonged to her father, braided her hair and splashed water on her face. When she stepped outside, Russell looked up from his work. There is coffee in the pot, he said, gesturing toward a small fire he had built in a ring of stones. And I brought some supplies from my place, bacon and beans, nothing fancy. Natalie's stomach growled at the mention of food. She had not eaten since yesterday afternoon. You went home and came back, quick ride. I wanted to get some lumber and my tools anyway. He nodded toward a wagon she had not noticed before, loaded with fresh cut timber. Figured we could use it. She poured herself coffee from the battered pot, black and strong enough to strip paint, and studied him as she drank. Russell worked with the efficient movements of someone who had spent his whole life building and fixing things. No wasted motion, every nail driven true. He had not been exaggerating about his abilities. "I cannot pay you," she said bluntly. "Not until I sell some horses, and that will take time." Russell straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Did I ask for payment?" "No, but I am not a charity case either." He regarded her steadily, something like amusement in his dark eyes. "I can see that. Tell you what, you can pay me back by helping me fix my north fence line when this is done. It has been down since the summer storms and my cattle keep wandering. Deal?" It was fair, more than fair, and they both knew it, but Natalie appreciated that he had given her a way to keep her pride intact. Deal. They shook on it again, and this time Russell's hand lingered just a moment longer than necessary before he released hers and turned back to his work. Over the next week, Natalie learned that Russell Fenton was a man of his word. He arrived every morning before dawn and worked until well after dark, building a new barn that was indeed bigger than the old one. He reinforced the structure with double beams, built the walls thick, and positioned the whole thing with clear sight lines to the house so nothing could approach unseen. She worked beside him, holding boards, hammering nails, learning techniques her father had never taught her. They fell into an easy rhythm, their movements synchronized without needing many words. Russell was not much of a talker, but when he did speak, it was usually something worth hearing. He told her about his ranch, about the mustangs he broke and trained, about the years he had spent as a cowboy on the big spreads before saving enough to buy his own land. Natalie found herself sharing stories too, about growing up with just her father after her mother died, about learning to ride before she could properly walk, about the dreams she had for breeding quality horses that would be known throughout the territory. On the 8th day, Frank Garrison came calling. Natalie was on the roof of the new barn, securing shingles, when she saw the dust cloud that meant riders. Russell, who had been working on the door frame, immediately climbed up beside her and shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun. "How many?" Natalie asked, tension coiling in her stomach. "4, Garrison and 3 of his men." Russell's voice was calm, but his hand moved to check the pistol at his hip. "Stay up here. If things go bad, you have the high ground." "This is my fight," Natalie protested. "Then fight it smart." He gave her a hard look. "A gun up high is worth 3 on the ground. You can shoot." "My father made sure of it." "Good. Use it if you need to." Then he was climbing down, dropping the last few feet to land in a crouch, and walking out to meet the approaching riders with an unhurried stride that somehow conveyed absolute confidence. Natalie positioned herself behind the peak of the roof, her father's rifle in her hands, and watched as the 4 men reined in about 20 feet from where Russell stood. Frank Garrison was easy to pick out, sitting tall on a black stallion that probably cost more than most men made in a year. His clothes too fine for ranch work, his face shaded by an expensive hat. The 3 men with him were hired guns, obvious from the way they wore their weapons and the cold way they scanned the property. "You are trespassing, Fenton," Garrison said without preamble, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "This business is between me and Miss Burton." "Miss Burton has hired me to work her ranch," Russell replied evenly. "That makes it my business too." "Hired you with what? Everyone knows she is broke." Garrison's smile was thin and cruel. "You are wasting your time and your lumber. This land will be sold one way or another." "She has already told you she is not selling. I suggest you respect her wishes and move along." One of the hired guns, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "That sounds like a threat, Cowboy. Just a suggestion." Russell's stance had not changed, but something in his tone made the hired gun sit back slightly. "But I will make this clearer. This barn you are looking at, I built it stronger than the last one. Burning it down would take a lot of kerosene, a lot of time, and a lot of noise. And I will be watching for anyone who tries. Every night, from now on. Garrison's face darkened. You are making a mistake. Would not be the first time. Russell tilted his head slightly. But here is the thing, Garrison. I am not afraid of the railroad, and I am not afraid of you. You want this land. You will have to go through the courts like civilized folk. But if you or your men set foot on this property again without invitation, if anything else mysteriously catches fire or breaks or disappears, everyone in Agua Caliente will know who is responsible. And I will make sure you answer for it. The threat hung in the air, backed by the quiet certainty in Russell's voice. Natalie found herself holding her breath, her finger resting lightly on the rifle's trigger, praying she would not have to use it but ready if she must. Finally, Garrison jerked his horse's head around. You will regret this, Fenton. Both of you. He spurred his mount and rode off, his men following, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Russell stood watching until they disappeared over the rise, then looked up at the roof. You can come down now. Natalie climbed down with less grace than he had shown, her legs shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. He will come back, probably, but not tonight, and maybe not at all if we make it too expensive for him. Russell turned to examine the barn. We need to finish this and get it stocked. The stronger your operation looks, the less appealing you are as a target. Why are you really doing this? The question burst out of Natalie before she could stop it. You said it was about your father, but this is more than that. You are risking your ranch, maybe your life. Why? Russell was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Maybe I am tired of watching greedy men take what they want. Maybe I think this territory needs more people like you, willing to fight for what is right. He paused, then added so quietly she almost missed it. Maybe I just wanted a reason to get to know you better. Their eyes met, and Natalie felt her breath catch. There was something in his expression, something warm and uncertain and hopeful, that made her heart beat faster. She had been so focused on survival, on keeping the ranch, that she had not let herself see what was growing between them with each shared sunrise, each past tool, each story traded over evening coffee. Russell, she started, not sure what she wanted to say, but he shook his head. Let's finish the barn, he said gently. We can figure out the rest later. They worked until the stars came out, and true to his word, Russell made a bedroll in the new barn and settled in to keep watch. Natalie brought him blankets and more coffee, and lingered perhaps longer than necessary in the doorway, neither of them quite ready to say goodnight. Over the following weeks, the barn was completed and began to fill with the necessities of running a ranch. Russell brought over spare tack from his place, and helped Natalie negotiate the sale of 3 of her trained horses to a rancher passing through on his way to California. The money was not much, but it was enough to buy feed and supplies and start rebuilding her reserve. True to his promise, Russell spent his nights in the barn, keeping watch. Natalie found herself looking forward to the evenings when she would bring him dinner and they would sit together, talking about everything and nothing. She learned that he liked his coffee sweet despite his gruff exterior, that he had a younger sister back in Texas. He sent money to every month, that he could play the harmonica, and sometimes did on quiet nights. He learned that she could recite poetry her mother had taught her, that she was afraid of scorpions but not snakes, that she dreamed of traveling to San Francisco someday to see the ocean. The attraction between them grew like a living thing, undeniable and fierce. Natalie caught herself watching the way Russell moved, the strength in his shoulders when he lifted heavy beams, the gentleness in his hands when he treated a horse's injury. She saw him watching her too, his gaze following her across the yard with an intensity that made her skin warm. One evening in late November, nearly 2 months after the fire, Natalie brought dinner out to the barn as usual. The air had turned cold with the desert winter, and she carried a pot of stew that steamed in the crisp air. Russell had started a small fire in a metal barrel for warmth, and the light danced across his features as she entered. "Smells good," he said, accepting the bowl she handed him. "You are too good to me, Natalie. You are sleeping in my barn every night to protect my land." "It is the least I can do." She settled beside him on the hay bale he had positioned near the fire, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of horses moving in their stalls a soothing backdrop. Finally, Russell set down his empty bowl and turned to her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Garrison came by my ranch yesterday while I was there checking on things." Natalie's hand tightened on her spoon. "What did he want? To make me an offer." "Said if I stopped interfering with his business, he would pay me twice what my ranch is worth and throw in a foreman position with the railroad." Russell's jaw tightened. "Tried to make it sound like he was doing me a favor." "What did you tell him?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Russell reached over and gently took the bowl from her hands, setting it aside, then captured both her hands in his. "I told him he could take his offer and his railroad and go straight to hell." Relief flooded through Natalie so powerfully she felt dizzy. "Russell, that was a lot of money." "I don't care about his money, I care about you." The words were simple, direct, but the emotion behind them made Natalie's eyes sting with sudden tears. "I have been trying to figure out the right time to say this the right way, but there is not going to be a perfect moment. I am in love with you, Natalie. I think I started falling the first night I saw you standing there watching your barn burn, so fierce and stubborn and brave, and every day since has just made it worse." "Worse," she managed, her voice shaking. "Worse because I did not know if you felt the same. Worse because I am just a cowboy with a small ranch and too much pride, and you deserve better." He squeezed her hands gently. "But I am selfish enough to tell you anyway, because keeping it inside was killing me." Natalie's tears spilled over, but she was smiling through them. "You think you are just a cowboy. Russell, you are the best man I have ever known. You rebuilt my barn, you stood up to Garrison, you gave up sleep and time and put yourself at risk for me. How could I not love you?" His eyes widened. "You do, I do. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it, afraid you were just helping out of obligation or pity or something that was not this." She freed one hand to touch his face, her palm against his rough cheek. "I love you, completely, desperately." Russell made a sound that was half laugh, half groan, and then he was kissing her. His lips were warm despite the cold night, gentle at first and then deeper as she responded with equal fervor. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and Natalie melted into him, into the safety and strength and rightness of it. They kissed until they were both breathless, until the fire had burned down to coals and the night had grown truly cold. When they finally pulled apart, Russell rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me." Natalie laughed, giddy and overwhelmed. "You are not serious." "I have never been more serious about anything in my life. Marry me, Natalie. Let me stand guard over you and this land for the rest of our lives. Let me wake up every morning knowing you are mine and I am yours." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I know it is fast, but when you know, and I know." She thought about everything that had brought them to this moment, the fire that should have broken her, the stranger who had appeared out of the darkness and become her partner, her protector, her love, the weeks of working side by side, building something new from the ashes of destruction. It was fast by conventional standards, but nothing about their situation had been conventional. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in Agua Caliente's small church, with half the town in attendance. Word had spread about what Garrison had tried to do, about Russell's defense of Natalie's rights, and public opinion had turned sharply against the railroad man. The local sheriff, emboldened by community support, had paid Garrison a visit and made it clear that any further incidents would result in arrests and investigations. Natalie wore a simple white dress borrowed from the shopkeeper's wife, and Russell wore his best suit with his dark hair slicked back. When he saw her walking down the aisle, his expression made her forget about everything else, every worry and fear and doubt. There was only him and the love in his eyes and the promises they were about to make. They honeymooned at Russell's ranch, a beautiful spread in the foothills with a sturdy house and a creek that ran year-round. Natalie fell in love with the place immediately, but they both knew they could not abandon her ranch, not when it had been the beginning of their story. They worked out a solution, spending their time split between both properties, hiring a hand to help manage the workload. The following spring, they held a barn dance at Natalie's ranch, now officially the Fenton Ranch, to celebrate the new building and their marriage. The barn that had risen from the ashes was indeed bigger and better than the original, and it filled with neighbors and friends and music. Natalie danced with Russell until her feet hurt, laughing as he twirled her around the floor, his love for her obvious in every touch. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Russell pulled her outside into the cool April night. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the desert bloomed with spring wildflowers that perfumed the air. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Natalie admitted. "A year ago I thought my life was over. Now I have everything." "We have everything," Russell corrected gently. "Your fights are mine, your joys are mine, your land is mine, and mine is yours. That is what we promised." She turned in his arms to face him. "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him go still. "What is it?" "I am with child. The baby should come in early fall." She watched his face anxiously, though she knew she had no reason to worry. Russell's whoop of joy could probably be heard back in the barn. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "A baby, truly." "Truly? Are you pleased?" "Pleased" does not begin to cover it. He kissed her soundly, then knelt down and pressed a kiss to her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I promise to keep you and your mother safe always." Natalie's eyes filled with happy tears as she ran her fingers through his hair. "I love you, Russell Fenton." He stood and gathered her close. "I love you too, Natalie Fenton, more than I can ever say." Their son was born in September 1885, during the first cool snap of fall. They named him James, after Russell's father, and he had his mother's blue eyes and his father's dark hair. Russell was utterly smitten, spending hours just watching the baby sleep, his large finger clutched in James's tiny fist. Garrison had left Agua Caliente by then, his reputation ruined and his railroad plans rerouted to go miles south of their properties. The sheriff had found evidence linking him to not just Natalie's barn fire, but several other incidents of intimidation and property damage. Facing potential prosecution, Garrison had sold out his interests and moved back east. Natalie sometimes thought about that terrible night when she had watched the flames consume everything her father had built. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, to letting the cruelty of greedy men drive her away. And then she thought about Russell appearing out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. When James was 6 months old, Natalie stood in the barn with him on her hip, watching Russell work with a new Mustang he was training. The building smelled of hay and horses and leather, wholesome and familiar. It was stronger than the original, more beautiful and filled with life and purpose. "Your father built this," she told James, who gurgled happily and reached for the sunbeam streaming through the window. "When bad men tried to destroy what we had, he made it better. That is what you do in life, my darling. When someone tries to tear you down, you build yourself back up bigger and stronger than before." Russell looked over and smiled at them, that warm, private smile that was hers alone. "Teaching him philosophy already. Someone has to make sure he grows up wise," Natalie teased. "He certainly will not learn it from you. I am wounded." But Russell was laughing as he vaulted over the fence and came to wrap his arms around both of them. "I taught you everything you know about barn construction. And I taught you how to make a proper cup of coffee instead of that tar you call beverages." They stood together in the barn Russell had built, with their son between them and the future stretching bright and endless before them. Outside, both ranches flourished under their joint management. Inside, their love had grown into something unshakable. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter they named Clara, who had Russell's dark eyes and Natalie's stubborn streak. James adored his little sister, following her everywhere once she could walk, appointed himself her protector. Russell built an addition onto the house at Natalie's original ranch, and they made that their primary home, the place where their family had truly begun. By 1890, the Fenton Ranch was known throughout Arizona Territory as one of the finest horse breeding operations in the region. Natalie's dream of building a reputation for quality had come true, exceeded even, and buyers came from as far as California and Colorado to purchase their stock. They hired several hands to help with the work, and Russell taught young men the skills his own father had taught him, passing on the knowledge and the values. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Russell surprised Natalie with a trip to San Francisco, remembering her long-ago confession about wanting to see the ocean. They left James and Clara with Russell's sister, who had moved out from Texas to help with the ranch, and spent 2 weeks exploring the city and walking along the beaches. The first time Natalie saw the Pacific Ocean, she stood on the sand with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the vastness and beauty of it. Russell stood behind her, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Worth the wait," he murmured. "Everything with you is worth the wait," she replied. "Though I prefer our desert, this is beautiful, but it is not home." "No," Russell agreed. "Home is where we built something from nothing, where we fought for what we believed in, where our children are learning to ride and cause mischief." They returned to Arizona renewed and eager to get back to their life. The children had grown in the 2 weeks they were gone, or so it seemed, and James had a new gap in his smile from losing a tooth. Clara had learned a new word, cookie, which she repeated endlessly until someone gave her one. The years passed in the way of happy lives, marked by harvests and birthdays, new foals and mild winters, small triumphs and manageable struggles. In 1893, Natalie gave birth to another son, Michael, who was the image of his father. In 1896, twin girls arrived, much to everyone's surprise, named Sarah and Emma. The house that had once held only Natalie in lonely silence now burst with noise and laughter and life. Russell proved to be the father he had promised that night when Natalie told him about James. He was patient and loving, firm when he needed to be, but always fair. He taught his sons to ride and rope and treat animals with respect. He taught his daughters the same things, insisting that his girls be just as capable as his boys. Natalie loved watching him with their children, seeing the gentle side of the man who had once stood ready to fight an army for her. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed, They would sit on the porch and watch the stars come out over their land. Sometimes they talked, sharing dreams and plans. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, Russell's arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "You ever regret it?" Natalie asked one such evening when they were both in their 40s and the children were growing toward independence. "Throwing your lot in with mine. You could have taken Garrison's offer, could have been wealthy." Russell snorted. "Wealthy and miserable without you. That is no kind of life, Natalie." He tilted her chin up so she met his eyes. "I meant what I said that night in the barn. You are everything. This life we built together, these children, this land that we fought for and earned, all of it is worth more than any amount of money." "I love you," she said, as she had said thousands of times over the years, and it never got old. "I love you too. Always." And he kissed her as the desert wind blew soft and warm around them, carrying the scent of sage and horses and home. By 1900, James was 15 and already working the ranch like a man grown, with his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. Clara was 13 and beautiful, breaking the hearts of every young cowboy in the county. Michael was 7 and wild as a Mustang, constantly getting into scrapes that made Natalie's hair turn gray. The twins were 4, identical and inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and confounding anyone who tried to tell them apart. Arizona had become a state, the railroad ran through other people's land, and Agua Caliente had grown from a dusty collection of buildings into a proper town with a school and a bank and a newspaper. The Fentons were pillars of the community, respected for their work ethic and their integrity. One spring day, when Natalie was 40 and Russell was 43, they rode out together to check the fence lines on her original property. It was something they still did together when they could, stealing time away from the busy household to be just the two of them again. They dismounted at the spot where the barn had once burned, now just a memory covered by the newer, better building. Natalie stood looking at it, remembering that terrible night and the terror she had felt, thinking her life was ending. "What are you thinking about?" Russell asked, coming to stand beside her. "About how lucky I am, how lucky we are." She leaned into him. "If Garrison had not burned the barn, you might never have come to help. We might never have met." Russell considered this. "I like to think we would have found each other eventually. Some things are meant to be." "You really believe that?" "I believe I was meant to love you, Natalie Burton Fenton. I believe we were meant to build this life together. Whether it happened because of a fire or a chance meeting in town or any other way, we would have found each other." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands. "You are my destiny, my home, my everything." After all these years, he could still make her heart race with his words, his touch, the love in his dark eyes that had never dimmed. She rose on her toes to kiss him, pouring everything she felt into it, grateful beyond measure for the cowboy who had ridden out of the darkness to rebuild her barn and had stayed to build a life. That night, with all 5 children finally asleep and the house quiet, Russell and Natalie lay in their bed with the window open to the cool spring breeze. Russell traced lazy patterns on her arm, his touch familiar and beloved. "Happy anniversary," he murmured. 16 years. 16 years since you asked me to marry you in the barn," Natalie agreed. "Best decision I ever made, saying yes. Second best. The first was refusing to leave your land, or I would never have had the chance to meet you." They drifted toward sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together. The barn Russell had built still stood strong, a testament to what could be created from destruction with hard work and determination and love. Their story became a legend in Agua Caliente, told around fires and dinner tables for generations. the woman who had refused to be driven from her land, the cowboy who had rebuilt her barn bigger and stood guard, the love that had blossomed between them, strong enough to withstand any threat. As the years advanced and their children grew and had children of their own, Russell and Natalie remained devoted to each other. They aged together gracefully, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and full lives, but their love never faltering. They had grandchildren who played in the barn Russell had built, who rode horses descended from Natalie's original stock, who learned the values their grandparents exemplified. On their 40th wedding anniversary, when Russell was 68 and Natalie was 65, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were over 30 people now, children and grandchildren, and even a couple of great-grandchildren. They filled the house and spilled out into the yard, and the sound of their laughter was the sweetest music Natalie had ever heard. Russell stood with her on the porch, surveying the family they had created, the legacy they were leaving. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but when he looked at her his eyes held the same warmth and love they had held that first night. "We did good, did we not?" he said, his voice a bit rougher with age but still steady. "We did better than good. We did wonderfully." Natalie squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that remained despite his years. "Thank you, Russell, for everything, for saving me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life. No thanks needed. You saved me right back, you know. I was just drifting before you, existing but not really living. You gave me purpose. You gave me love. You gave me a reason to be the man I always wanted to be." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I would do it all again. Rebuild that barn 1,000 times if it meant having you." They stood together watching their family, the fruits of their love and labor, and knew that they had won. Garrison had tried to destroy her, to drive her away, but instead she had found the love of her life and built something far greater than he could have imagined. The barn he had burned was replaced by something better. The fear he had sowed was replaced by joy. The ending he had planned was replaced by a beginning that had led to this moment, surrounded by people who existed because two stubborn souls had refused to give up. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple, Russell and Natalie Fenton stood together on the porch of the ranch they had fought for and built together. Their hands clasped, their hearts full, their story complete. The barn stood strong behind them, a monument to the power of love and determination. And in its shadow, generations would grow up hearing about the cowboy who had rebuilt what was destroyed, and the woman who had been brave enough to let him stand guard. They had taken ashes and made them into something beautiful, something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. And that, they both knew, was the greatest victory of all.